Hello, pattern readers. It is time to talk spoilers for the first 2 episodes of The Rings of Power. If you are avoiding spoilers and you have not seen those 2 episodes yet, don't watch this video yet. Bookmark it, go watch my spoiler-free review if you want, and come back to this after you've watched the episodes. I guess if you don't mind spoilers, let's carry on. If you want to see me talk about The Rings of Power specifically as an adaptation and how it functions as an adaptation, I'm going to be discussing that on my second channel called What the Adaptation, where I have 3 regular co-hosts, Glenn, Max, and Jen, and we are excited to be talking about this show as well, so I hope you will check that out. I will put a link for you. So first up, in episode 1, we got to talk about Galadriel, because this episode is very much focused on her, and we get basically this really significant sequence that takes place before even the title of the show appears in the episode, and it's all focused on Galadriel. We are taken back to some events from the First Age. Now, the focus of this show is on the Second Age, but in this little prologue that we get here, we're focused on the First Age. We see Galadriel as a child in Valinor, and we see her relationship with her brother. So things are idyllic for them at that point. Now, keep in mind, there's like a whole history here, but they're really just like referencing some tiny pieces of this because they're adapting source material from The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and the appendices. I just want to be super duper clear here. Amazon does not have the rights to adapt the Silmarillion or anything else that Tolkien wrote outside of The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit. So if something is not mentioned in those specific volumes, they can't include it in their adaptation. They also have to be careful not to overtly contradict anything that is in the source material that they don't have the rights to. Galadriel's idyllic life in Valinor is disrupted by faraway events in Middle-earth. Morgoth is engaged in massive destruction, and Valinor is sending aid. Hosts of elves traveling across the sea from Valinor to Middle-earth to try and defeat Morgoth. This is the events of the War of Wrath. They don't use that term in the show because I think maybe they're not allowed to if that specific term is not referenced in the text that they're adapting, but that's what we are seeing here. Near total destruction of Middle-earth, but Morgoth is defeated. Galadriel's brother is killed by Sauron. And then we see that Galadriel, after the death of her brother, sort of takes this mission upon herself that she is going to seek out and destroy Sauron and ensure that he is gone completely from Middle-earth. And that for centuries she does this. She hunts him to the most remote corners. By the end of this sequence, she's got just this small band of followers with her. You can see that they don't believe in it in the way that she does. She is the one who is driven. She's lost all support that she had in that. What this whole prologue does, I think, well, is establish the drive for Galadriel's character and the stakes for her. So we're setting up her character, where she's coming from, what is so important to her, and why. So that's all really important. It's a lot of history condensed, but it might also be like missing some pieces. But again, I think the overall point of establishing Galadriel's character, they're doing that. Maybe, this whole sequence where Galadriel is leading this small group, they're climbing up the ice, going into this most remote area. That whole sequence maybe went on a little bit long. They could have maybe like trimmed that down somewhat. And I'm just going to say maybe preemptively, because I guarantee you there are going to be some people who have an issue with Galadriel just like wrecking this ice troll that they encounter. Guys, did you watch the Lord of the Rings movies? You've seen Legolas fight. You've seen how elves can fight. Why would Galadriel be any different? The rest of Galadriel's story in this episode is basically after this small team that she has with her abandons her, they're no longer willing to follow her on this mission that no one else believes in. We then see that Galadriel returns to Lindon, where she is to seek an audience with the king, Gil-galad, and she's also reuniting with her old friend, Elrond. This whole sequence was, interestingly, a very different side of the elves at this point. First of all, we see them sort of like a peaceful, idyllic setting. We see them as warriors, and then here we see them as politicians, basically. One thing that I'm curious about is the friendship between Elrond and Galadriel. I do appreciate that they're sort of establishing it because it enables them to have some scenes together where they're just like kind of really getting to the gist of what's going on with these characters. I'd kind of love to see that explored more. So I'm curious to see if that's going to happen in this season. Gil-galad chooses to send Galadriel and the elves who have been fighting with her back to Valinor as a reward, and basically saying, job well done. You've done what you set out to do. Galadriel isn't buying it, right? She does not feel like she's done. She went there to ask for more support, and she's clearly not getting it. I'm conflicted about this because Galadriel is right, of course, that Sauron is not gone. She's the only one that's right about that. On the other hand, the way she's going about it, how would she ever know that he was really gone? You kind of get the impression that nothing would ever convince her. You know, she's both right and wrong, perhaps, in this, but I think that is probably deliberate. You know, a character can be right and wrong in multiple ways, and that is more interesting. After Galadriel is sent off, Elrond and Gil-galad are talking, and it's clear that Gil-galad, at least, believes that she's right, that Sauron is not gone forever, but he's not going to tell her that because he believes that her continued searching for him could actually be the thing that is a catalyst for him coming back. Well, there's a good point there, but he's not sharing that information with her. He is like keeping that to himself and just sending her off with a little pat on the head. Of course she's going to be frustrated by that. Of course she's not going to like take that in the way that he wants her to. Not necessarily great choices being made by any of these supposedly super wise elves. But you know what? I appreciate this because it makes these characters a little bit more real. They can't see and know everything. They are very powerful, but there's complexities and layers to these characters as well. I did have to wonder why Galadriel got on the ship to Valinor. She said she wasn't going to go, but she gets on the ship anyway, for her to then ultimately decide not to go, to jump off the ship at the last moment. I guess that makes it a much more dramatic choice. I will say thematically, the way they show the light of Valinor as blinding, I think that was a nice choice because, you know, we think of light as something wonderful and wholesome, but the way it's portrayed there, to Galadriel at least, you know, from her perspective, maybe not to everyone, it's overwhelming, it's blinding, it's not inviting. She's not ready to go there. It can be as harsh as darkness. And so thematically, I liked that scene quite a bit. And it does tie in to what young Galadriel is struggling with as far as how to follow the light, and her brother's giving her advice. Initially in the beginning of the episode, we don't know what he says to her. And by the end, we know that he's said sometimes to be able to know where the light is, you do have to touch the darkness. And so I think that's, again, telling us a bit about what her journey is going to be. So episode 1 establishes Galadriel very well. Elrond is probably the next best established character in that plot line, but not as well as Galadriel, definitely. There's more to do to really show us what Elrond's drive and what his role in the story is going to be. So let's move on and talk about the other two plot lines in this episode. The one that will be really easy for a lot of fans to enjoy is the Harfoots, just because they are so similar to hobbits, really delightful group of little people. It's familiar in a way, but their culture, their way of living is different. The way that it's really being created here is lovely. I actually really enjoy all the care and detail that went into creating that culture specifically. In this episode, there's not a lot of drive to that plot. It's more just like we're being introduced to these characters, their culture, who they are. The one character who stands out is Nori Brandyfoot, and she's a really lovely character. I think it's going to be easy for fans to connect to her. I enjoyed her a lot and am just interested to see where she goes. You know, she's definitely a character who's looking outside to the world and outside of her own culture and has a great deal of curiosity. So you can see how she could be pulled along in different directions, or not just pulled, like she would be the one to have that drive within her that would take her in who knows what directions. The third plot line in this episode, the two main characters in it are Arondir and Bronwyn. Arondir is an elven warrior. He's been stationed in a certain spot for many years as part of the war, and it's near this tiny little village where humans live. And one of them is Bronwyn. She is a healer. She also has a teenage son. The father of her son is no longer there. We don't really know what are the circumstances of that, but she is a single mother. They seem to have some sort of a romance or connection that they're keeping to themselves, but I don't think it's that much of a secret because this village is tiny and I don't think you can really keep secrets. But it does look like they're going to explore elf-human love matches and what the pressures are to perhaps not engage in that kind of a romance. So, that could definitely be interesting to explore. And we saw it a bit in The Lord of the Rings. So we've seen that a little bit from the elven side, but also maybe we need to see it from the human side. And it's hinted at here that there's definite human prejudice towards elves, referring to them as pointies and so on. So we get into that little bit of lovely racism angle. So I definitely see the potential in this storyline, but they definitely have some work to do too, because we're kind of dropped in on their story at this point where they already have feelings for each other. We're not seeing that develop. We don't really know how long this has been going on. We now have Arondir being taken away from this village because Galad has said the war is over. So Arondir is no longer going to be stationed there. So we have that as a potential catalyst to explore what's happening in this relationship, but we need to kind of get the audience a little bit invested in them. So they still have some work to do on that point. I guess also pretty noteworthy here is that Bronwyn's son, Theo, has this piece of an artifact, which probably belonged to Sauron based on the symbol that we see on there. How did he get this? What does it mean that he has it? Overall thoughts on this episode, some pieces of it are stronger than others. I wish they had been able to give us just a little bit more about how all of these different storylines are going to connect into a whole. What's the overarching plot? Although the end of the episode is fairly exciting and intriguing with this meteor coming down perhaps, and a large person who is lying there naked in this burning hole in the ground after he crashes. Well, that's intriguing. So I have thoughts about that, but it's unclear. I'll talk more about that for episode 2. So episode 2, I would say that overall, not as much of a focus on Galadriel in episode 2 as there was in episode 1. So this isn't as strong an episode for her as the first one was, but that's okay. We're just kind of shifting the focus a little bit. So overall, Galadriel's plotline in the second episode didn't work as well for me as the first episode. Just the whole premise of jumping into the ocean and the whole sequence of events. So she comes across some shipwrecked individuals who are sort of surviving on what's left of a ship. Big sea monster, and there's storms, and then ultimately she ends up with just her and this human man, Halbrand, who we know is going to be an important character. It just wasn't as much of a drive or purpose for this plot line in here. I think it's leading somewhere, so I'm just going along with it. She and Halbrand are found by a ship. We don't see the face of the person on the ship. My impression is that this is going to be a Númenórean ship, and then that is where Galadriel might be headed next, but I could be wrong. So as for Nori, her plotline definitely gets more interesting in this episode. She finds this man, unclear exactly who we're dealing with here, the Stranger. We're calling him the Stranger, site of where this meteor has landed, and she's trying to help him. He doesn't really talk. He doesn't really give us a whole lot to go on here. The way these scenes are presented is sort of a mix of humor, and the things are a little bit alarming and tense at the same time. It's unclear what to expect from this character. If I had to guess what is going on with this Stranger, given the way he ends up on Middle Earth, could he be one of the Maiar, or wizards, that are sent to Middle Earth to deal with Sauron as he is coming into power. It was just the only thing that kind of made some sort of sense to me. But I'd love to hear any of your thoughts on who this character might be, if not that. Like, what are your theories and why? One thing that is generally known about the Maiar is that they come disguised as old men. So all the wizards that we see appear to be old men, tall old men. He definitely fits that description. Beyond that, and his way of getting to Middle Earth, apparently in a meteor, I don't have a whole lot to go on because he doesn't really say a whole lot. But overall, I am intrigued by that storyline, kind of eager to see where Nori's storyline goes with this. There's definitely a lot more action happening with Arondir and Bronwyn in this episode. For example, we see that Theo, her son, who has the artifact of Sauron, it's getting bigger. He's doing something with it, interacting with it. This does not bode well, so that was kind of alarming. Arondir and Bronwyn go off to investigate this other village that is destroyed, and so there's basically just a lot of menace in this storyline that is growing, and then it sort of culminates in Arondir is sort of searching out this tunnel. He's seized. There's an orc that makes its way up into Bronwyn's house. She has to kill it and display it to the villagers, basically all right, you are going to take this seriously. One thing I liked about it, and even one orc is a big deal, especially for someone who isn't a warrior. We sometimes see these hordes of orcs, and we see these super powerful characters that are taking on just countless numbers of them. So to see a more ordinary person taking on a single orc, we see how big of a deal that one orc is. Now, she is able to kill it, so good on her, but it's definitely not easy. And then probably my overall favorite part of this episode was actually Elrond's story. So he kind of gets his own little plot line in this episode. First, he's meeting Celebrimbor, and we see how Elrond's story might then end up connected there to the eventual forging of the rings. Although this isn't, laid out yet. We're just kind of laying the groundwork for this. But that wasn't the most interesting part. The most interesting part is when he travels to Khazad-dûm and goes to see his old friend Durin. And then we meet Durin's wife, Disa. So these are two really fun characters. And honestly, my favorite scene in the episode was the Elrond and Durin and Disa scene. Because here's where you get to just see characters interact, just the dynamics between them. There's a lot of humor, but you also get to see this difference between how long elves live versus dwarves. And Durin's really kind of mad at Elrond because he just hasn't been around in the 20 years. And to Elrond, that's it's nothing. It's a minute. But to Durin, he's lived a whole life in that time that Elrond has missed. So I liked that contrast in the dynamics between those characters. And yeah, that was definitely my favorite part of the episode, and it was just welcome to have those characters introduced. So overall, in these first two episodes, they're juggling so much. They're introducing us to so much, so many locations, so many characters. It's a ton. I definitely didn't feel overly confused by anything or finding it hard to follow. So that's an accomplishment. I mean, granted, I at least have some familiarity with these stories. If someone was coming into this without knowing anything, might be a different experience. But I think that part is good. I'm still looking for things to kind of come together more and to have more of a sense of what drives each of the characters, not just a couple of them, but as many of them as possible. Let's really get me invested in more of the characters and show me what's really driving them and get them really interacting more. I want more of the, one-on-one or small group character interactions. I'm hoping that we get to see more of that. I'm hoping we get to see more of being immersed in a specific location. Again, looking forward to seeing how the plot lines start to come together in an overarching themes and plot that drives things forward. Overall, as I'm reflecting, I think these episodes are, pretty successful in getting things set up, starting to establish the world, starting to establish the characters, and starting to see how the plot is going to drive forward a little bit. I'll mention a few nitpicky things that didn't affect my overall enjoyment of it, but just, things I noticed. When it comes to costuming, a lot of it is really awesome and definitely very intricate and detailed and pretty. When it comes to the costumes that Galadriel and her cohort are wearing, and they're like climbing in these icy barren mountains, they're wearing like chainmail, which is sort of decorative and it looks cool. And maybe that's like an elven style or whatever they were going for. Why aren't they dressed in like warmer clothes and layers and furs or something? And you could say, oh well, they're elves, maybe it doesn't affect them, but the dialogue was them talking about how they were affected by the cold. So that was a little bit of an odd choice. They also didn't really seem to have packs, like they're in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and I didn't see them wearing packs for any kind of supplies. So, that might have made a little bit more sense too. I was expecting to really like the score more than I have so far. I do notice how they're tying the score in with the mood, and there are mood changes, and so they do kind of need that to help with the mood shifts and changes, and it works. But there wasn't anything particularly memorable, I guess. Nothing that really kind of set it apart. And maybe it's just, I'm maybe unfairly comparing it to the score from the Lord of the Rings movies, which was so beautiful and perfect. And so far, it's not at that level for me. Similarly, I guess, with the dialogue, there was nothing really wrong with the dialogue. Maybe I'm just looking for like something to be kind of memorable lines, lines that are really well written that just kind of stay with you for the words themselves. Maybe you think of Tolkien and you think of words, and the dialogue's not quite there. It's not, again, it's not bad. Just looking for something a little stronger. But ultimately, what do these episodes have to do? Establish the world, establish the characters, start to draw us in to the world, to the characters, and get us to sort of like feel and care. I can't say for sure if it's going to work as well for someone who is coming into this not having previously any level of familiarity with the Lord of the Rings. So maybe that's a relatively small amount. I mean, maybe a lot of us have at least some familiarity, so that's going to help ease us into it. But if you didn't have that, it might be harder. Like, there's a lot of characters, there's a lot of locations. They're trying to juggle a lot of these things, and some of it's stronger than others. And we're not entirely sure how it's going to all tie together. There's not a really strong inciting incident. So some of these things might be a little bit weaker than they needed to be for someone who is coming in totally blind. You hope that the stronger elements, the world building, the beauty of the cinematography, there's lots of intriguing things happening, right? Some mystery, a few strong characters, there's enough there that's going to pull people in and at least want to keep watching more. And I definitely want to watch more. So looking forward to what comes next. I'd love to hear your thoughts on these episodes in the comments. What did you love? What didn't work as well for you? Give me your thoughts, and try to be polite and respectful, because some people are going to like things that you didn't like or not like things that you did like. That's okay, guys. We can all like different things and still hopefully have a civilized conversation about it. If you enjoyed these reviews, I hope you did. Leave me a like, consider subscribing to the channel. I hope you will come back for more as I continue to review this season of The Rings of Power.